Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about the hot mess that was the Crusades. Before we get into the Crusades, let's have our not so dark ages fun fact of the day. Today's is more of a correction on a myth. Officially, the life expectancy for someone in the so-called Dark Ages was around 30 years old, which sounds awful, until you take into account the fact that infant mortality was extremely high in this time period, which means if you made it out of childhood, you probably lived to at least age 50. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, the Crusades are a hot mess and a really small period of history that gets over-romanticized by everybody. The reality is, the Crusades were not as big of a deal as you think they are. So let's talk about what the common conception of the Crusades is today. Generally, when people talk about the Crusades, they'll say stuff along the lines of, the Crusades were a holy war against Islam led by power-hungry popes and fought by religious fanatics, and the epitome of intolerance in the Catholic Church. They were the beginning of imperialism that brought Western aggression to a peaceful Mideast, leaving the enlightened Muslim cultures in ruins. The frustrating thing about history is whenever we talk about the Crusades today, all we can think of is what Europe became and what the Middle East is like right now. Where if we want to do an honest treatment of history, we need to look at what Europe was like during the Crusades and what the medieval world was like during the Crusades. So as we go through it, I want you to forget everything you know about what happened in the 1,000 years after Crusades and put yourself into the shoes of a 10th and 11th century Christian or a 10th and 11th century Muslim. We need to look at the historical background of what's happening in the Western world. In the Western world, for the past 400 years, Muslim invaders have been attacking from multiple points. They've been attacking up Spain. Rome has been sieged multiple times. Constantinople almost falls multiple times. For 400 years plus, those who are living in Europe have been under constant threat of being conquered by Muslim invaders, and at this point, 2/3 to almost 3/4 of previous Christian land has been conquered by Muslims. Right, so right now we know that in the modern time, Europe is one of the world powers, right, the Western world. But in the Crusades, the world power was not Europe nor the Eastern Empire. Both the Holy Roman Empire and the Eastern Byzantine Roman Empire are really middle of the line two crumbling empires. The East is falling apart and the Holy Roman Empire it's doing okay. The world power at this time is the Islamic world that has again conquered the majority of Christendom. And so the Crusades are actually better seen as a defensive war trying to reclaim what had been lost to the Muslims. Consider this. Let's say America conquers part of Canada. Say we take over Toronto. And we control Toronto for 100 years. And then the Canadians want Toronto back, and so they attack and retake Toronto. And then we retake it, and for 1,000 years, we retain Toronto. 1,000 years from now, if we've had Toronto for that long, why would we remember Canadians taking back Toronto for 50 years and then losing it? Right? The Crusades, from the Muslim perspective, were just a bunch of failed counterattacks that meant nothing. And what's interesting is the Christian world had been losing land to the Muslim world for 400 years, but it's actually not until 1095 that the Christian world decides to fight back and go on the offensive. And so this leads us to the question of why did this happen? And a simple answer that is of course more complex than this, but this would take weeks to get into, is that a new group has taken over the Muslim world, which is the Seljuk Turks. Ever since Muslim invaders took over Jerusalem in the 600s, Islamic leaders still allowed Christians to live in the city And more importantly, they still allowed pilgrims from Christian lands to come to Jerusalem. This was an incredible economic machine for those in charge of Jerusalem. And so Muslims had no problem with Christians coming to Jerusalem and taking all these pilgrimages because they knew they were going to pay plenty of money, right? They needed places to stay. They would buy foods. They would buy, this and that. So pilgrimage was incredible economically for Muslims. And during this time, the Christians were all infighting, and you had things like the Great Schism going on. So there wasn't this pressing need to get Jerusalem back because the Muslims were letting Christians go there anyways. So it was not really on the forefront of their thought. But then the Seljuk Turks take over, kick out those in power, and they close off Jerusalem to pilgrimage and no longer let Christians come into the city. This leads to Pope Urban II calling the First Crusades. Now, of course, Pope Urban is also trying to unify the West and the East together under a common enemy, but he has two stated goals for the Crusades, and these really become the two main goals for the Crusades in general. The first is to redeem and save Eastern Christians who are now living under Muslim rule. Many Christians were taken as slaves by Muslim invaders, and those who were not taken as slaves did have to pay a tax. And so the Western world thought we should save the Eastern Christians. And the second was to liberate Jerusalem, one of the patriarchal seats of the church. Now remember, the last thing we covered was the Great Schism, where the Western Church and the Eastern Church broke off. And as you saw from those videos and from the readings I had you do, the main reason that the West and the East broke apart was not actually theological, but was cultural. That Latin-speaking Christians and Greek-speaking Christians just did not get along anymore because of how different they were. And so really what the Crusades were trying to be is a reunifying of the church, trying to bring together the East and the West. And so they were going to liberate Jerusalem. Now the First Crusade, like all of them, was a hot mess that had, a bunch of unprofessional peasants who were not actually soldiers pillaging and burning the Christian lands all the way until they got to Jerusalem. Like nothing went right. There was no leader. It's actually ridiculous that this crusade succeeded. But the results of it is the Western soldiers actually reconquered Jerusalem and set up a new Jerusalem kingdom that would last for about 100 years. The issue is when the Western peasants and knights were going to reclaim Christian land from the Muslims, the impression that the Eastern Empire got was they're going to return the land to us, the Eastern Christians who had this whole time. But what actually happened is when the Western Christians go, reconquer Jerusalem, and they actually reconquer Antioch as well, they say, no, we're going to keep this for ourselves. And so the Christians who were living under that land did not actually get their land back, but now were under Western Christians, and it was a hot mess. But the real crusade I want to talk about is the Fourth Crusade, because this is the most ridiculous crusade of all. The plan is to retake Jerusalem through Egypt. And so the Crusaders are all gonna go to Venice, they're gonna hop on the ships, they're gonna sail down to Cairo, and then from Cairo they're gonna go up to Jerusalem and retake it, because Jerusalem has been taken back by the Muslims. And so all the Christian Crusaders go to Venice, and Venice builds all of these ships, but of the 35,000 Christians who volunteer for the Crusades, only about 11,000 actually show up. And so Venice, the city, has just built enough ships for 35,000, and less than a third of that has shown up. And so they're like, well, who's going to pay for this? And the Crusaders are like, well, it's not my fault. So the Crusaders and the Venetians strike a deal. Venice will let them use the ships if the Crusaders help them capture a rebellious city that hasn't been paying dues, essentially, to Venice. The city is called Zara, but the problem with this is Zara is a Christian, it is a Catholic city. But the Crusaders are like, yeah, this works for us. So they go, they attack Zara with all their ships, and the attack fails. Now you have a bunch of crusaders outside of Zara hanging out, licking their wounds, and the Pope gets word of this and he excommunicates both the crusaders and the city of Venice for this, essentially calling off the crusade, saying, look, you're supposed to go and reclaim Jerusalem, and instead you attacked a Catholic city. Well, the crusaders are now all stuck outside of Zara. Venice still does not have any of its money, and so along comes an exiled Byzantine emperor. This guy has just been kicked out of the East and usurped by another guy. And so he goes to Venice, finds all these crusaders, and says, look, Venice, I will pay for the fleet and I will pay for you, crusaders, if you help me retake my throne in Constantinople. And so all of these excommunicated crusaders are like, okay. And so they go to Constantinople and they successfully sack Constantinople.
What?
So we just had Western Christians attacking the most important city for the Eastern Church.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
Well, the reinstated emperor doesn't have enough money to pay off the Crusaders upon the recapture of Constantinople. And so he says, just wait around a little bit and I'll get you your money. Well, while that happens, a coup occurs and that emperor is executed and a new emperor takes place and tells the Crusaders, get out of here, you're not going to get paid. And so now you have a bunch of Crusaders hanging out in Constantinople without any promise of pay.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
So what do? That's right, they sack Constantinople, and this leads to the bankrupting of the Eastern Empire and sets up the Eastern Empire to be conquered completely in the coming years. And so the Crusades, which started out as an olive branch from the Western Church to the Eastern Church, trying to protect the Eastern Church from Muslim invaders, ends up with a crusade that actually attacks the Eastern Church and leads to its eventual downfall. As you can see, these things did not go well. And so, for the next couple decades, crusades continued, but the only real successful crusades were the first and the third. The others led to a lot of deaths and were generally failures. You can see that these completely failed based on the Battle of Vienna in 1683. And I'm only jumping forward this far into history because the Battle of Vienna, right, modern day Austria, is the high point of another Muslim invasion. So these invasions of the West do not end because of the Crusades. They don't succeed in any real manner. And so to say that these were these big events in history is actually kind of ridiculous. So where did this narrative that the Crusades were this incredible, imperialistic attack from the Western Church that led to this renaissance of the Western Church come from? Well, it generally comes from the Enlightenment and then the 19th century Romanticism and rise of nationalism, right? Because this very strange thing happens in the 17th century in the Enlightenment. The internally divided Christian West that was always on the brink of being conquered by the Muslim East suddenly becomes a powerhouse. I'm not going to really go into how that is, but in the 16 and 1700s, Europe starts to become powerful and starts to become more what we know of it today. That constant threat of being conquered disappears, right? From the year 600 to the year 1600, right? 1,000 years, European Christians were always under the threat of being conquered by Eastern Muslims. Well, this threat now disappears. And when you don't have a threat anymore, you start to look back on another time period and say, this was ridiculous. What were y'all worried about? Because we forget what it was like to live in their shoes. And so Enlightenment thinkers who emphasized rational thought and religious tolerance alone looked back at the Crusades and called these things barbaric, unnecessary, right? These didn't need to happen. And then what you have is in the 19th century, rise of Romanticism, that everything in the past was incredible. And this rise of nationalism, this national pride. And so European countries start to justify their colonialism and their imperialism by looking back at the Crusades. The unfortunate thing is the Crusades start to get painted as this colonial expansion back in the 11th century, which couldn't have happened considering the Western Christians were the ones being colonialized and being conquered, right? The Crusades themselves were actually defensive, but the 19th century European nations didn't care about that. Instead, they just used it to their advantage. So they started taking over land from Muslims that had been there for about 1,000 years since they conquered it from the Christians in the 600s. And they start teaching these conquered people, these conquered Muslims, about the Crusades. Now, what's really important to know is the Arabic term for the Crusades was not used until the 1850s. And the first Arabic history of the Crusades is not written until almost 1900. And this makes sense because if you really think about it, like really put yourself in the shoes of a 10th century Muslim, you are the world power, right? You've been taking over so many different parts of the world for centuries. And suddenly this people that is almost conquered does a couple counterattacks, they take back some land, and then it gets reconquered. Why would you remember that? Think about this as a perspective as an American. Right? America is the world power right now, and as a culture, we're generally illiterate when it comes to other cultures, especially Islamic culture, right? And we don't pay attention to these other cultures because, in terms of power, they are so beneath us, right? And so, in this same way, in the 10th, 11th century, in that whole time, when the Islamic world is the world power, uh, Muslims generally were illiterate when it came to the cultures of other places and the histories of them. So most Muslims at that time didn't even know the Crusades happened. And so this idea that the Crusades led to the violence that is now is ridiculous because generally they failed, generally they bankrupted Europe, and the Muslim world completely forgot about them. This is why you don't see a word for the Crusades showing up in Arabic until the 1850s. Because everyone had forgotten that they happened. It was actually when Europe colonized a bunch of the Middle East that the Europeans reintroduced the idea of the Crusades to all the Muslims who forgot it happened. So the Crusades, for what they were when they were important to the people fighting them. But to say that they were this aggression of the Christian West against the peaceful Muslim East is just revisionist history. So were the Crusades great? No. Right? They were a hot mess. There were probably more Christians pillaged and killed by Crusaders than actual Muslims. Most of them failed. Most of the Crusaders who went died, leaving their own families bankrupt. Like, was it good that a pope suddenly is calling people to go to war? Of course not. Right? The Crusades are not a great thing. But if you look at them in the context of what they were Christians trying to retake land that had been theirs for a long time. So, the goals of the crusade were first to reopen Jerusalem for pilgrimages, and secondly to reunite the East and the Western Church. The result is they do temporarily open up the Holy Land for about 100 years, and that falls apart, but also solidifies the Eastern Schism between the Western Church and the Eastern Church because of the Fourth Crusade, where Western Christians completely destroy Constantinople. Any hope for the East and the West to reunite is shattered by the Fourth Crusade. While the Crusades were religious in origin, they were questionable in practice. Speaking of hot messes, thank you for getting to the end of this video, which I edited so much out of it that it could have gone on for a while. But I hope you're a little more interested in the Crusades and kind of getting into the actual history, rather than just kind of the cultural assumptions that are just completely inaccurate in so many different ways. Otherwise, I hope you all are doing well. Stay healthy and stay holy, everyone.